Hi everyone, Caleb Rundell here, and this is your video for Acts chapter 6. Now this is a short chapter, but there is a lot going on here. So Acts chapter 6 starts with a problem that comes from the rapid growth that the community has seen, and that this problem needs some administrative attention. What we hear in verses 1 through 6 is that the Hellenists have some complaints, that the widows who are part of the Hellenist community, our subgroup, are not receiving the same amount of food as other widows. Now, we have to understand when it says that there are Hellenists in the group, so a Hellenist is something related to Greece or Greek culture, and these are people who are religiously and spiritually Jewish and Hebrew, but they are culturally Greek. Now, they are not Gentiles. Gentiles do not show up in Acts until chapter 10, and there's a whole big thing about that. So we'll get to that. But when it says that these Hellenists feel that they're not being treated equally, it means people who are possibly ethnically Jewish, they're definitely religiously Jewish. They're now part of the church and the Jesus movement, but they would still call themselves Jewish, as everyone does pretty much at this point in the story of Acts. But they are culturally and linguistically Greek. And this is fairly common in this part of the world. If you recall your history, Alexander the Great, that is, Alexander the Great, conquered everything from Greece all the way almost into India. And part of that conquest was Hellenization, meaning that Greek culture and ideas and philosophy and language was spread all throughout the world. Egypt, Judea, what we would now call Iraq and Iran and Central Asia, like Uzbekistan even. And so this makes sense that there are Hellenists who are part of the Jesus movement here. Okay. So all that being said, not really important for the story, but there's this division in the community, Hellenists and non-Hellenists, or Hellenists and Hebrews, they would probably say. And so they set up a committee to resolve this problem, to handle this issue. You could say it's the first church committee, our church team that is set up. And it says that the disciples, and then there's 12 of them, and remember that includes Matthias, if you remember from chapter 1, the person selected by lots to take Judas's place, decide, okay, we're not going to handle this because we've got enough on our plate, pun intended, but we've got enough handling with our duties as leaders and preachers and healers and all that stuff that we need people who are just focused on this. This is about delegation. This is about specializing people to do specific things. And it's a great success. People are like, yes, that's a great idea. Let's do that. So they select these 7 people to make sure everyone gets the food that they need. And this all comes from the community and the way things are functioning that we read about in chapters 2 and chapter 4, where people are bringing what they have and selling goods and bringing financial resources, and they're all sharing things in common. So you have to have a system to figure out who's getting what. And so now there's a team to make sure everyone's getting the food that they need. Okay, so that's all set up. Then in verses 8 through 15, there's a shift. We had just heard about Stephen. Stephen is chosen to be part of the food distribution team, and we hear that along with those duties, he still has the power and the gifts to be an amazing witness and do amazing things, and that gets him in trouble. So much like what we read with Peter and John, there are people who are part of the Jewish community who don't like what this new movement around Jesus is doing, and Stephen gets their attention. And it says that this group of people from the freedmen, our freed persons synagogue, argue with Stephen. Now, what this means is this is a synagogue, a group of people who are which is specifically made up of freed persons, people who were formerly slaves and are now free. We don't know a whole lot of other details by that. In the Roman Empire, it was very common for people to be enslaved and then get their freedom in any manner of ways. You could buy your freedom, you could earn your freedom, it could be given to you. Slavery in the Roman Empire, that's talked about in the New Testament, very different than slavery as it existed in the United States. Lots of people experience slavery, never a good thing. always bad, but there were lots of ways that people could get out of slavery as well. And so here's a synagogue made up of people who were formerly enslaved or now free. And they start arguing with Stephen, and they can't win their argument. Now, there's some geographic names mentioned in there. Cyrene is what we would now call Libya. That's the Libyan coast. Alexandria, we just talked about Alexander. Alexandria is still a city in Egypt founded by Alexander the Great as he was Hellenizing the known world as he thought of it. Cilicia is the southeast coast of Turkey. And when it says Asia, it's not referring to an entire continent, the largest, most populous continent. It's referring to just the western part of what we would now call Turkey, which in the Greek and Latin worlds, when they said Asia, that's all they meant was just the western part of Turkey. Okay. And then that name gets applied to an entire continent. So figure that one out. Okay, so that's where these people are from, which doesn't really have a whole lot to bear on the story. It's just good to know what these terms are. So they get into an argument with Stephen and they get frustrated. And so they plot to get rid of him. So they get people stirred up, and people are already agitated because this group is already causing problems. They've been arrested. They've been before the council and the high priest and everything. So doesn't take much to get people riled up. They get people riled up against Stephen. They come up with these false accusations that he's saying things he's not saying, that the temple's going to be destroyed, which Jesus didn't. Jesus said that, but that's not going to come for a few decades when the Romans do finally tear down the temple, and it has stayed that way ever since. But Jesus never said he was going to destroy it. And they have these false accusations. And this all sounds very similar to what we read about in the trial and the arrest of Jesus, that they get witnesses and false testimonies together and bring it to court. Okay. Now, and that's where Acts chapter 6 leaves us, kind of a cliffhanger. It gets resolved in things coming up, but chapter 6 here ends on a bit of a cliffhanger with Stephen arrested and this plot and these conspiracies working against him, possibly leading to capital punishment. We'll find out. So that's your notes and your videos for chapter 6. Hope it's insightful. Lots of interesting things going on. We'll see what happens with Stephen in chapter 7. Take care, friends.